I suppose it's my job to sort of think about where there might be sort of connections or not. And there seems to me to be some interesting things going on between the idea of sort of touch and the real in relation to what you were talking about, Richard. And I was thinking, I suppose, things like the way that post-structuralists have seen to it that we're not allowed to think about realities in general, and to the point of eradicating the potential of the real and suggesting it only as a sort of romantic, nostalgic notion and dismissing the actual potential in it. So I was thinking about your touch in relation to the real and the way you try to sort of think about what the potential is in touching, the potential for different ways of thinking and critique. So that was one thing, and I was sort of thinking about the real in relation to what you were talking about too. So, and I'm not trying to stretch this, and it's because I'm sort of interested in the real as well. So, in terms of real conflicts, real ways of protesting, real ways of acting that are more, and there's something in that comes out of this thing that you were talking about in terms of touch, which is, for me, there has to be something else other than language, and so I'm sort of wondering about what that thing is as well, and I'm not sure. And I suppose as an art, thinking about the history of art, I'm already sort of worried about thinking about touch as well, because I'm worried about thinking about skill in that sort of way. So I'm trying to think about something that isn't that does something with the real, but it doesn't return to some sort of phenomenology or something like that. So I wondered if you could maybe comment on that, if you get what I'm sort of going on about.
You're plunged into reality.
Yeah, deep reality. No, but I mean, we don't have to connect two talks when they're not connected, and even if they would be connected, then we don't have to agree. So we don't have to do an overly effort to somehow merge those. Although, of course, when it comes to the question of the conditions of production of art, and then it comes to art making, this is something that I do recognize as a crucial part of the process that I'm involved in. In the case, for example, seeing that it's still projected on the background, in the case of the construction of the parliament, for example, there is no public work done in the Rojava region without consultation of the 33 communes that consist of the city of Derek. So that means that if you plan something, even with a minister of foreign affairs, as I collaborated directly with her, she does not have any authority over that land. She only has an idea, and her idea and my idea merge, of her organization and my organization, but at the end it does have to pass 33 assemblies to be debated and shaped and reshaped endlessly before it arrives at the point of being an actual physical object. So that means that making an artwork in the context of Rojava or in the context of a self-governing region, the production of art, the conditions of production of art also change. There's a much more direct relationship between the users of the artwork, the symbolic function of the artwork, and the production of the artwork. They come closer one to another, because with the revolutionary changes in that specific region and the political ideals, also the ideas of art and how you make art and with whom you make art also change. Sure. So that was a point where I had to think of it, because all the time you were talking, that image was still in the background, so it was like somehow forced to kind of bring the impossible together. But that's something that I did have to think about a lot, and also how, more than in any other endeavor, and I think that I said it also in relationship to the people that I work with or that are part of my team, that grounded us very literally in this case in a specific place and in a specific community and in a specific political ideology. So yeah, that was the kind of first thought that came into mind when you were speaking about the idea of art as something that can overcome alienation, between so-called publics and artists.
Yeah, which I believe is true. I have a question for you, or an observation. These are discursive spaces that you're creating, where people can talk to each other. They're not really agoras, they're pnyxes. You know, this is a fundamental difference between two kinds of public space. Pnyx is it's a theater. People sit, they listen to the flow of words. It's a diachronic space. You concentrate. For the ancient Greeks, the fact that they were sitting down meant that they were passive. You know? Whereas a proper agora, like the ancient agora, is a place where many things are happening at once. It's not a discursive space because lots of things going on. You could bank, you could pray, you could give your opinion on somebody tried for murder, you know. You swanned from one thing to another. That's a synchronous space. In a synchronous space, and this is why I think about this, physical presence and nonverbal activity matter a lot more. For me as an urbanist, I'm really, and you can see why from this talk, I'm much more interested in synchronous spaces than diachronic spaces. I'm interested in the experience of blacks, whites, Muslims, Christians occupying the same space and having a kind of physical propinquity. The great criticism of this kind of publicness that I've been talking about is that people like Jürgen Habermas, who is my most relentless critic, including when my wife and I go on vacation with him, he never stops. But in his view, what's wrong with this is that there's no intelligence at work. There's no communication going on because people aren't talking. And to me, he's fundamentally wrong about this, that we have all sorts of kind of haptic knowledge about people who are different, which is nonverbal. But there's a big, in the sort of public theory world, it's been, and ever since I published my book, I've had this debate with him about this. For Habermas, a public realm is a realm of language. And for me, it's a realm of bodies and sensate experience. And I just to finish this, I just wonder if this were shaped in a different way so people could just hang out without having to have a parliament. If you put different kinds of people there, you'd have a different kind of public realm and public experience. Would you have a different kind of politics, do you think?
I mean, it's more an observation than a question, but an interesting one.
It just came to my mind.
I mean, in this case, what you see on the left, you see an old park that was developed under the Assad regime, but kind of abandoned afterwards. So what we're doing is we're pulling that park from the left over that former road that has now been destroyed. This road that we have taken away. So it's going to be built up until the edges of the surrounding of the parliament.
That's fantastic.
And there's a series of public works that are going to be developed around it that partly take this kind of spherical shape as a departure point, but more as a way of indicating space than actually fully constructing it. Of course, the parliament is a place that can be used for a variety of uses. Basically, mainly it will be used by cooperatives and local communes. It will be used for international congresses and for starting and endpoints of protest, because there's many mass protests in the region. But it does coexist directly in relationship to the idea of it being a recreational space, or at least that these two realities do not have to negate one another.
Right.
But this is obviously the kind of flaw of
that's
still
great.
building. Yeah.
But there are two different kinds of public spaces, and they have two different kinds of politics in them. I mean, the kind of politics I'm thinking about is that a Muslim woman could feel comfortable being in that park on her own,
Right.
or groups of Muslim women
Well, this is
with men.
Yeah.
That's a body politics. It's not a discursive politics.
Mhm.
It's much more in this physical realm. You're going to make the two together is wonderful. It's not an either or for you.
No, it's not an either or. On a side note, the Rojava region is a majority Muslim region, both in the Kurdish Arab side. Assyrians are generally Christians or more oriented towards Christian religion. So the people we work with are, I mean, that's also what I mentioned when it came to the multilingual mentioning of the different concepts within the parliament. The self-administration communicates in 3 languages minimum because the enormous differentiation in the region. And the whole idea of democratic confederalism or stateless democracy was also that it would be a model that's different than the history of the nation state in the Middle East, would be a model that could recognize the religious, cultural, linguistic diversity of a region rather than having to enforce a singular one. So the development of this space and the people that participate in that process are, of course, thinking from that specific angle, like from that specific starting point.
Yeah. So in social theory terms, you're thinking about what you're thinking about is democratic process rather than state process, right? You're thinking, excuse me, I put that wrong. You're not thinking about governmentality. You're thinking about participation rather than governmentality. Because all these people there is nobody to govern because they're stateless. Is that right?
Well, essentially, because they have declared statelessness not as a position in which they are oppressed. They have not. Being stateless is, of course, there's nothing to romanticize about it. But in the specific case of the Kurdish movement, they have declared statelessness as a precondition for a different approach to democracy, a different practice of democracy, different performance of democracy in my vocabulary.
Right.
So yes, even though the term participation is just a hard one, because what has been developed here in the UK under Cameron as big society, in the Netherlands, the same liberal think tank of Cameron introduced it in the Netherlands, and it's called participation society, which is very much related to discourses around the commons, for example. So these terms have become so impossible for me to approach that I rather speak in terms of self-governance, autonomy, performance rather than participation, etc. Yeah.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference is that, I mean, essentially what you describe as participation, it probably means exactly the same as what I'm trying to indicate, but language changes because of specific changes in politics, and some terms become impossible to approach. Like, for example, I could never say that I am in defense of democracy, but I can say that I'm in defense of emancipatory democracy, because when I say democracy, no one has any idea what I mean.
Yeah.
In the name of the same democracy, we can bomb one country, and in the name of that same democracy, referendums can be pulled that could maybe make an end to the Troika regime in the European Union, which it didn't, but maybe almost. So we have to twitch and work on these terms all the time, both in language but also in form. That's what I was trying to explain, the complexity of the use of the maps, for example, or the depiction of the representation, imaginary of autonomy, political autonomy, is a very tricky one in similar ways, both because of the history of the map as a form that's inherently part of state administration and territorialization of space, but also because it limits our imaginary of autonomy in terms of space. So that was, of course, why Dillar's intervention of proposing a fully ideological map was a very interesting one, and that allows also immediately into a different visual translation in terms of this specific parliament.
Can I ask you something? Sorry, I want to get in. It's just because you've sort of switched from touch and the body quite a lot, and for me they're quite different. And I don't know, I'm being really pragmatic about it, because the notion of touch, and as you describe it, I can't help but evoke things like experts and skill, and experts in drawing, experts in playing the cello, and so I was stopping myself trying to not do that as you were sort of talking about it. But then when we talk about the body, I've got that somehow that frees me from touch, and I don't know if it's because I'm a visual artist, and so that whole touch thing. Or that whole skill and experts and has been, we've had sort of the 20th century rethinking what it means as artists to be, you know, proficient and technically great, and what that means. So I sort of bring that sort of baggage to it, and then but when you say bodily, I feel more comfortable, because I think about, for me, bodily means not just discursiveness, and I'm sort of fed up with the dominance of discursiveness without the body. So I suppose I'm asking you what you think the difference between touch and the body is. And
well, touch is a bodily sensation. I think what you're worrying about is a notion of skill, and not touch. You're worried about skill.
I suppose because you use the example of cello playing.
Well, this is what my craftsman book is all about. I have a very particular take on all of this, and I know it from my work as a musician. I think most people can be skilled to a relatively high degree. The whole proposition of neoliberalism society, neoliberalist society, is that skill is scarce, that only a few people have the talent to become really skilled. And that's very serviceable for inequality. It's the whole notion of meritocracy is founded on that notion that you've got to find this scarce skill. And the way it's structured in society is, if you think only 1 in 30 people could really be good, the tendency is to go find that person and neglect the other 29. That's what's happening in British education now. That's exactly how it's going. And one aspect of that version of meritocracy is that the higher the level of skill, the less physically embodied it is. As an American, I can measure this in something very, very profound difference between my generation and what young children do now. In my generation, every American had to take shop class, no matter whether, or if you were a woman, you had to take home economics. It's too bad, because I love to cook. I would have taken it, but it's gender confusion. Anyhow, but the point about this was that this was a rock-solid mixing of every American student. They did something physical. They had the kind of democracy of this physical thing, of either learning how to cook or how basic carpentry and things like that. That's gone now, because it's seen as something that interferes with what a really skilled person is, who is, in the words of Robert Reich, a symbolic manipulator. Such a wonderful phrase, both of it. That it's essentially a deracinated, dephysicalized, dematerialized activity. Now that's a resonance that I and other people on craft like Matt Crawford have, which is quite particular. I don't think you ever had shop class.
Like workshops or
right.
medal shops.
But I mean, the idea about that is that there is something about insisting that people be physical with their hands, which I think is very democratic. It actually owes itself to Ruskin, who believed this. But I think your worry is not about that. Your worry is about the fact that when we talk about skill, what we seem to be inevitably talking about is hierarchy. And I think that's wrong. In music, it's true. You know, there are 1 in 300 people who have got a kind of musical sensibility, which is unusual. But the notion that you'd only educate that unusual sensibility and leave the rest behind is absurd, because they can, in fact, develop, fairly high levels of being good musicians. And my argument in The Craftsman is that that's true about most jobs. It's not just true about learning how to sing or learning how to paint. That most, and it's an argument, this book is so cheap, you should go out and buy 2 or 3 copies of it. It's an argument I make at the end of the book, that when we look at what are the skills required to do good work in most jobs, I don't mention banking, which is the obvious confirmation of my case. It doesn't take all that much. You don't need to be a genius to be good at most of the jobs that people do in modern capitalism. You certainly don't need to be a genius to be a banker. But the ideology, the dominant ideology, is that because skill is scarce, that basically what you have is a neglect of this development of ordinary people. And that's a sort of basic political economy built into thinking about things like how to do things. If you start by assuming that everybody can pretty much do, that most of the things they have to do, most people can do, then you have a completely different idea about whom society should reward and not reward than under this Blairite notion of meritocracy, where the whole thing is to promote the unusual person. Again, for Americans, this is a very grinding thing because that's how we've constructed racial relations. That it's more likely that blacks are going to have less talent than whites. That's a ground rule of American racism. So they need compensatory education. They need to be subject to different rules if they're let into a university than whites, because basically there is that racial divide. So that's a politics for me in skill. And as I say, it's such a cheap book. You can read the argument in full about this.
Could I turn to you and ask you just one question? One more question before I'm sorry, I'm hogging you both before I open it up. But I just wanted to ask about consensus, really, because I've been sort of thinking about consensus. And I suppose I was thinking that I sort of realised, there's this sort of ideology of consensus that it's a given good, as well as, so I've been a bit suspicious as well of the dialectical position of consensus and dissensus, within, and so I just wanted to ask you about what you think about that. And also, and I suppose I was trying to think of, I'm sort of aware of the limits of Chantal Mouffe's agonism, which you could pragmatically sort of suggest deals with that, but because I don't like this sort of type of pluralism that sort of bothers me, sort of untogetherness, which I'm sort of exactly. And so I sort of wondered what you thought about consensus, especially when you're sort of talking so much about democracy and whether you're, and maybe it's an abstract question, not a question about whether consensus happens here, but just as an idea, really.
Right. Well, there was there's a very interesting cultural I'm just going to go back to this place one more time because I was there now for 3 months, so I cannot really talk about much else. I'm really sorry about that. There are many artists also active in the Rojava region and also very involved with the revolutionary movement and the construction of new society, etc., etc. There's one that's called the Rojava Film Commune, and I had the chance to interview one of their founding members, Dr. Hesso, and the whole film commune is actually an attempt to introduce cinema in the Rojava region because it was banned for a long time. Ba'ath Party of Assad controlled all cultural centers, so only people that were members of the Ba'ath Party had access to any form of public culture, anything that looked like a museum, historical sites, cinema, everything. So they now, for some reason, began to start screening The Kid, the film by Charlie Chaplin from the 20s, for the first time. So they started to make rounds and propagate on their workers and everyone in the region to kind of mobilize them to see this specific film, but they're also trying to create films of their own because they're very aware that with everything that's happening in Syria now, there's masses of journalists coming into this region that walk in for, I met like a couple of CNN people, they walk in like for one day, try to look for the first woman with a gun, film her, ask her 2 questions, get out of there again, and then the next day it's on TV. So they feel also their imaginary of their movement is very much plundered in that sense by it's also a market in and of itself somehow. So the whole film commune was made in a way to kind of reclaim the right to self-representation, the same way that the movement tries to reclaim the right to self-governance. And when I did this interview with Diyar to understand what the commune was doing and all about the economy of images and people coming from outside, people from within Rojava that cannot travel outside but want to represent themselves or are working on that process, there was a cat that walked around him all the time. It is a very young cat. It's the cat of the film commune. So it jumps on everything and it continuously tries to subvert us having an interview. It's a great cat. I really like this cat. And and I said, what's his name? And then he said, terrorist. He explained, like, that's the name of the cat. I said, why? Why would you call your cat terrorist? And he said, because we're all terrorists here. And for me, that was somehow like a kind of key sentence, because, of course, from the perspective of all surrounding states, because the Kurds are related to the PKK movement, the guerrilla struggle, etc., that is, of course, essentially true. In order to overcome the false dichotomies between consensus and dissensus, you have to become terrorist. It means, but terrorist in this case does not mean you have to join an ultra-fundamentalist, fascist organization called Daesh, but terrorist means we have to separate ourselves from the regimes that govern us in order to re-articulate the kind of world we want to govern ourselves in. Then, of course, there comes the more complex question that you also named. Does it only apply to local governance? How are we facing crises that are common crises in terms of common crisis of humanity? Obviously, autonomous regions such as Rojava cannot be an answer to that at once, but they propose models by being terrorists or by performing as terrorists that are necessary to invent this new language of political autonomy, as well as a new language of art, as the film commune proposes. Sorry, this just came in as a anecdote.
Shall we ask the audience for some questions? Whoops, okay. So is there anyone with a question?
I've got 2 questions for you, Jonas. Sorry, Richard. No. I was wondering, what's the relationship, or how do you link, what's the positioning of your organization with or towards violence, as maybe some of the participants might have a violent past. For example, I'm thinking of the Basque Country at the moment. And my second question is, how does the financing of the project impact on the conceptual ideology of the project? Thanks.
Hardcore. I'm tempted to like refer you to my lawyer of some sort and leave the room. But
Sorry.
No worries. Good questions. The question of violence is of course a very, very crucial one. I think for everyone that is currently invested in what we would call the left or progressive movements or emancipatory movements, I think the question of violence has been one of the main restrictions for us to achieve what we want to. Meaning, okay, that sounds very cryptic. I was involved several months with a group of artists in the Occupy movement in the Netherlands, also with several student protest movements that came as a result afterwards. One of the things that I found the biggest problem of the Occupy movement was the fact that it rejected the concept of violence by definition. And with that, I'm not saying that a social movement should be violent. What I mean to say is that I think it's strategically very, very, very unwise to reject violence at forehand and restrict oneself to a kind of humanitarian doctrine that we're all in this together and you don't have to worry we occupy your squares, but we will do nothing in case you try to get us out. Now, of course, Occupy movements have been very different from New York to Amsterdam. So these have had, in Oakland, for example, there has been much more physical confrontation also with police and with authorities. But this question, of course, is the moment you touch on the fundamental monopolies of power that we are inhabited by, there will be violence, not because we want to, but because that is what will be projected upon us. Again, the case of Greece is a very good recent example, like the level of institutional intimidation and interrogation and the way in which that country has been taken and the sovereign people has been taken hostage by non-democratic forces is a very good example of different types of violence. Does not necessarily have to be physical, there's institutional ones as well. Anyway, I believe in the right to self-defense. My organization believes in the right to self-defense. That, of course, does not mean that every act performed by organizations we work with that we by definition agree, or that we agree with every organization's ideology. But an act of self-defense is something different than an act of violence. And violence is, first of all, in the hand of those who occupy and not those who resist occupation. However black and white that may sound, I know it's much more complex in day-to-day reality, but that is the kind of fundamental principle that we abide to. And it counts on many levels. For me, when the student movement in the Netherlands 1 year ago kicked in the door of their university because their student loans were taken away from the government, instantly reducing education in the Netherlands to something that is dependent on how much money you have to buy into knowledge. For me at that moment, that so-called act of violence of kicking in a door and occupying the school, that was how the university responded. You have acted violently against our school. No, you have acted violently against us. Our common resource of education was taken by us in one snap of a finger and in the parliament. And to take it back, to reoccupy that institution, is an act of self-defense, and in my perception, fully legitimate. So that this can go from the micro to the macro, in the sense from the resistance of a nation against an occupier, to that of our commons being occupied by the structures that govern us. The second part, a very complex one, financing of the summit, is incredibly difficult and has led to several problems, especially funders pulling out at last moments or trying to pressure us to stop the projects, or would be like a whole line of wonderful juridical anecdotes that I could put in front of you in that line. Here, for example, it's a collaboration. So half of the parliament of the construction is funded by the Democratic Self-Administration of Rojava, and half is funded by my organization. And my organization then means that out of many different projects I do as an artist, I also take money to do things that no one really wants to give money for, or that are too risky for public funding organizations, for example, to support. But I also sell works. So, for example, there are maquettes, like architectural models, and by buying the work, a buyer supports the construction of this parliament. So that also gives us some private funds to work with. So that way, moving from public funds, private funds, to the investment of the organizations of the self-administration itself. But it's really complex. Like every project has a kind of bizarre financial scheme, because it really depends also on the difficulty of getting the people together in that specific space, the specific political situation, how much pressure we get in not doing it, canceling it, or etc.
Is that in a way, would you say it's a way of washing money through art to reinvest it in the project? So wash it from political ideology, from private funds towards your own. Would you say that might be true?
Towards blacklisted organizations, I have no comment. No. No, I don't think it's. No, I wouldn't. Obviously, I wouldn't call it whitewashing, because even if it was whitewashing and I would say it now, it would not benefit the future of my practice. So I wouldn't call it that way. But of course, you're right that through the organization New World Summit as an artistic and political organization, we do try to reallocate funds for causes that obviously are not supported directly by powerful institutions, whether that institution is a state or whether the institution is a cultural fund. It does work through me / the New World Summit but it wouldn't work in that sense directly. So that's absolutely true. It is a way of relocating and relocating these funds and trying to use them to invest in political imaginaries and movements that we feel are absolutely crucial, but it also contribute to our idea of what art is and what art could be. So this is a mutual exchange in that sense, mutual collaboration.
Can we go to another question?
This is a question for Richard. And as you were speaking about the notion of touch, and I couldn't stop thinking about how our brain has mirror neurons that will reproduce the structure of what we are observing. No? So if I'm touching someone, or if I'm touching an object, someone who is looking will unconsciously reproduce that movement, and how that has affected our evolution as a species, no? And how has allowed us to learn in ways that it was impossible if we didn't have them, no? And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking how that is also related to the notion of empathy, and how empathy and touch is something that somehow has been left on the side on many policies, or let's say on the evolution of the world that we live in, in the last decades. And I was wondering, what is your opinion of if you're interested in the notion of empathy connected to touch, or especially there is a kind of a political potential in empathy, and
Right. This is a wonderful question, and I tell you what my own thoughts about it have been. It's trying to think how to. Well, I'd say two things to you about this. One, there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is you see somebody fall down on the road and you go, oh God, I identified with them. It hurts. You have a kind of sympathetic sensation. Empathy is quite a different thing. It's that you see somebody else hurt and you don't feel that could have happened to me, but that they hurt. And a lot of the research on what's called haptic imaginaries, which means just simply as though it's an imaginary touch, divides on this difference, that sometimes we have this sensation, as with a person falling down. That's a haptic imaginary that's based on sympathy. But for instance, if you see somebody shot, and you don't feel like the bullet went into you, but you want to know what happened to them, if you're objectively more orientated to them rather than for identification, and we're curious about what is it, that's a kind of empathic version of this haptic imaginary. And the reason it's rather abstract, although neurologists are obsessed with this difference, because we had to, for them, they point out, if we had to identify every haptic imaginary with something we could imagine happening to ourselves, the game is over. Our brains wouldn't develop. You know what I mean? We wouldn't be able to think, that's new. I don't get that. What's that about? So they're obsessed with it. I've thought about this a lot in terms of the urban environment. That is, things like eye contact, imagining that what the human scale of a street is, and so on. That we're always imaginatively touching this thing. We're not actually touching it. We're having this neural phenomenon is going on. And the better we get at empathy rather than sympathetic, the more we know about this environment. And it's very complicated, but it's a very, very important thing. If you have to identify with everything, you're in a steady state, give an example to this. Say somebody who is, well, black, is describing some act of discrimination. And the white person is very sympathetic and says, I know exactly how you feel. That's terrible. You know, it's an act of appropriation. Whereas if you say, what did you feel about that? That's an empathic and much more egalitarian kind of response. So it's, you know, it has that ethical dimension to it. It's neurological, but I also think it's a way in which we learn environments. And, you know, I'm going to try and show that in this book. But it's really an important thing that you put your hand on, as it were.
I have a question for Jonas. So I hope you have been following the Turkish and Kurdish media and what has been going on the past 4 years or so. From 92 till 99, these Kurdish military has been bombing and attacking a lot of places in major cities to people who has nothing to do with these political relations. And in the last 3 years, the government has been trying to expand on Kurdish rights, because I also believe that as a minority they deserve to express their own language and traditions and have a place in the parliament to participate. And HDP is one of the pro-Kurdish parties in Turkey. And until the elections in July, they have been very peaceful, and they had a very nice approach that many people voted for them. But in the November elections, there has been statements that they want bloodbaths and they will attack people, and they are not in agreement with this peaceful approach anymore. And in 2015, there has been 4 attacks in Turkey, mostly supported by PKK, who is the military group of Rojava. My question is, like, there's another side of this, and why would you personally choose to support them?
Okay, I have to think a little bit of how to answer, because I imagine that many people in this room don't know all of these abbreviations and organizations, and that always makes it a bit difficult to talk about the work, because everything demands so much context to do any justice to these specific struggles. So yes, I'm familiar with the history of the massive militarization of Kurdish inhabited areas ever since the 60s, 70s, and of course it has a history from the very foundation of the Turkish Republic in the first place. And I'm very familiar with the fact that it has increased over the last month, since the last elections, actually, since the last summer, actually, in which the Erdogan regime started a war on terror, supposedly focused on all terrorists, including the Islamic State, but actually only using it as an excuse to eliminate its Kurdish population. And seeing that the European Union is now funding the Turkish state with 3 billion euros to stop refugees coming into Europe, there's of course hardly any government that would say stop, because we now have a benefit in them doing exactly what they're doing. As far as I know, the Democratic People's Party, the Democratic pro-Kurdish party that you're referring to, has always called to peaceful negotiation, and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the armed movement of the Kurds, and HDP are not by definition related to one another, or not by definition working hand in hand. So you're describing a lot of different events. It's very difficult to make a general statement about that, in the sense they would each ask for like a very particular discussion. Overall, the question you asked was why support one side and not the other. It's not a question of fully supporting one side. For us, what we're doing with the summit is engaging specific political visions and ideas of political autonomy in a variety of forms. So that goes from the model of the independent state in the case of the Amazigh community, the Kel Tamershek that I was talking about before, to the model of democratic confederalism and what that does to our understanding of art and culture and what the role of art and culture is in the process of building these autonomous structures. That doesn't mean that nothing goes wrong. That doesn't mean that there's not also that there's terrible things that happen in the context of political and violent conflict, but that is our specific engagement. And on an overall level, I would say that the mediation of occupying and oppressing states at this stage very, very, very much outweighs the few solidary artists, independent media, etc., that try to work together, collaborate, learn from, contribute to resistance struggle.
Just wanting to ask about the New World Summit and in particular about the Parliament and how democratic it is. I mean, who decides who represents these movements and nations, and so who sits in the Parliament? To use the example that's most familiar to me, Scotland already elects representatives to 3 parliaments, and the independence movement holds seats and has a voice in all 3 of them. So there's already a democratic route to Scottish independence.
Yeah. Well, yes. Then, of course, the question is who has the right to decide if that is, in the very concrete case of Scotland, is of course the question who has the right to decide if that is enough, and that are the, in my perception, the communities of Scotland and no one else. Like it's not up to me or to us to say, as non-inhabitants of Scotland, you have had enough autonomy. Look, you are represented in 3 parliaments. That's not exactly the point. There's an element of historical social justice involved in that as well. This is a discourse, of course, that has been very much directed at Basque Country, at Catalonia as well. You already have regional autonomy. Isn't that enough? Do you not have enough democracy now? Well, it's not exactly. It's not upon the person who asks that question to make that assessment. It's up to that is the core of the right of people's self-determination, is that it's not up to us to decide over someone else's body or community. When it comes to the summit itself, what you have to imagine is that the summit started with a question in 2012, when it invited organizations that are listed as Black Lives organizations, so-called terrorist organizations, indiscriminately. This also concerned organizations that we truly do not support ideologically speaking, but of which we support the right to representation, or at least we oppose the politics that are being imposed through the blacklists. But from one summit to another, you have to see it as a kind of ongoing choreographical, also not choreographical, as an ongoing political experiment in search of what could be forms of assembly and what could be models of representation, what could be models of autonomy that could build a larger collectivity. So it's an organization that, even though I make a lot of statements, it started also in that sense with a question. What would it mean if we start to narrate the history of the world or the history of our current political order from the side of those who are fundamentally excluded from it, traceably through these very obscure policies of the war on terror? And what happens when we build from what we build from there? And from that initial moment, from that initial question to now being in the process of building this parliament here, this is an ongoing, that has been an ongoing process. So for example, in the case of Brussels, we work together with an organization that's called the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, the UNPO. It represents about 46 unrecognized states from all over the world. And the proposition of the Brussels summit, when we organized it, was entitled Stateless State, was for all of these organizations from this network, from the partner network, to be involved. And they decided, they themselves replied to this invitation, yes or no. So there was a kind of very clear body of organizations that we involved. In the case of the blacklisted organizations, it were all organizations that were blacklisted. In the case of working with the Kurdish self-administration, it is the invitation from the Kurdish self-administration. So who are present in the parliament depends also on the specific geography. It depends on the specific question the summit departs from. There are now also organizations that contact us before that we even can contact them. That builds a whole new kind of new project, because we try to also imagine how we can involve them in, or how we can contribute to their specific struggles, ones that we didn't imagine were there. So yeah, that's another, it's not very much of a yes or no question. This is how we are democratic, but it is an ongoing process in which we are looking for forms of assembly that can challenge our current ideas of what democracy is or what a more emancipatory democracy could be.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm very happy to hear you. And when I was listening like the both positions, I was thinking in the text of Walter Benjamin, the storyteller, when he talks about two different, no hierarchical or contradictory, but different ways of communication or way of storytelling. One is the informative, which is about what happened, how it happened, and the information must be verifiable and have to be able to be checked. And I think that hearing the answer is that you were given where the structure that you used was very informative, informing us what happened on the parliament, what was happening. On the other hand is the narrative way, where the information can be verified, but it's not about what he's saying, but rather how he's saying. And I was thinking when you were giving the explanation about the touch and the glass, and that information made me personally understand it, not by hearing you, but trying that with my hand in order to experience that dimension. So it's not a knowledge or information that I can get through listening, but rather through my experience or trying to grab something that I had in my hand. And I wanted to make that comment and how seeing how these versions that are not, as Benjamin was saying, opposite or one better than another, but they are connected. One informative, where controversy about information can be on different details, and other narrative, where it is how you experience that information through your hands and through your body. And and the last question that, well, the first was a question is, when you were talking about the classes of home finance, and what I understood is that it's like a proposition about a shift in education, where it has to do with how we feel and how the experience of touching that is related to game. And because through playing we experience this tactile interactions with other people. So I wanted to ask you, Richard, how you see that relation with education and game.
Well, it's a wonderful question. I guess if you bring a sleeping bag, we can really get into it. I would say about the Benjamin distinction you bring up is a very important one. As I read him, it's not quite that way. I'll give you an example from cooking. That if you read a recipe, you won't know how to cook. You've got to actually engage in the process of trial and error of making it work. The recipe is a narrative, but it's a narrative which is informational, let's say. It tells you how to do something. And the analogy in education is when we give people recipes for how to do something, that doesn't mean they know how to do it. So I think what Benjamin is after, actually your question relates to the question that the gentleman asked about empathy, that it's a much more performative understanding of, and that's what a narrative is. It's a performative act. And what I would, what I've thought about this is that actually most of the education we get, I don't know how it is in an art school, but in a university, most of the education is recipe education without any kind of performativity. So for instance, in my school, London School of Economics, you can take a class in how to interview people without actually having to go out and interview them. That's, you can actually, the same thing is true if you do quantitative work, that you don't have to actually do the work of organizing a survey, because you're always reading about. And I think part of this whole, the educational part of this, is to kind of combat that notion of passivity, that if you're told how to do it, that you know how to do it. You know, it's a fundamental error in knowledge. You know, again, this goes back to this whole this was the whole point of the pragmatism of which is that simply put in a little more philosophical terms, that the analysis of what an action is doesn't lead to the performance of that action. That was Dewey's fundamental proposition. It's also true of people like Paris in thinking about language. If I tell you how a grammar functions, you don't know how to speak grammatically. You know? So it's a profound distinction, but it's about a kind of narrative which arouses practice and a narrative which is more on that informational side, I would say. It's time to go eat.
I really like this. I really like this reflection. Actually, I was just thinking that while you were saying it, the distinction between the informative and the narrative, like the difference of question, because Richard gets all these like hyper poetic questions.
Yeah, and you got
like
it.
how do you relate to the relation between empathy and touch? That's very good. And then and then there was the second on game theory and everything. And then I get like are you whitewashing money for insurgent organizations, or we do like the whole review of insurgent organizations in North Kurdistan? But I think it's
terrible students.
But I think it's
terrible students.
no, I think
Blame them.
I think it's brilliant. I mean, it's kind of part of the. It reflects like the different positions that are here on the table and different vocabularies that we use. I also think for me and for many of my colleagues that are also directly involved with political organizations or refugee groups or are part of it or are trying to contribute to it. It's a continuous. We all face, I think, the continuous dilemma between trying to find a language that on one hand does exact justice to what you're dealing with. Like you cannot be involved with actual day-to-day politics and not know at least like the basis of what you're talking about. So in that sense, there's that limits an element of what you would otherwise maybe be also a play of language or play of words, or, and I don't mean play as in a way of as not being serious, but play as in a challenge of language, and that is a dilemma that I recognize very much. Also, because of the work that I'm doing, I think that the challenge is somehow to. That's I think for me is the process where we're in. The challenge is somehow to connect this field of politics and political change with the field of morphology, so the genealogy of forms, or let's say the domain in which we relate to the world through form, produce form, read form, visual literacy, essentially, what we, I think, fundamentally contribute as artists, to find a language that can somehow, that recognizes these two. For me, the example of the film commune is, for example, one of them, in which, through the film commune, we understand something about what the revolution has made possible in terms of new forms of culture, and through these new forms of culture, we also understand something of what this revolution is trying to become in terms of a larger societal model. But I liked your question because it made me think of, or your observation because it made that dilemma very evident. But it's, I think, a very important one.
Are you ready? Thank you.